Impact the future of hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans in the U.S. under temporary protected status. The U.S. Supreme Court is allowing the Trump administration to strip their legal protections.
That order puts a lower court ruling that found the administration had wrongly ended TPS on hold. The justices issued an emergency order that lasts as long as the court case continues. This is the second time the Supreme Court has made such a move.
In a major Supreme Court decision, justices ruled that federal prosecutors overreached when they charged hundreds of people who rioted on January 6th at the U.S. Capitol with obstruction. Now those charges and convictions in the attacks those charged in the attacks are looking to see if they have any new legal options.
There needs to be, again, a connection to the destruction of records and documents, not just, blocking a proceeding.
An unusual ideological alliance. Conservative Justice Amy Coney Barrett joined two liberal justices, Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan, in dissenting. The case was brought by former Pennsylvania police officer Joseph Fisher, who entered the Capitol on January 6th and was charged with obstruction of an official proceeding.
Okay, so here's something you need to understand about presidential power. The President of the United States has a lot of authority, executive orders, emergency powers, command of the military, control over federal agencies. But here's what the president doesn't have. The president doesn't have unlimited power. The president can't just do whatever he wants and hide behind something called executive privilege. The president can't block investigations by claiming everything is protected. The president can't override Congress and the courts just because he says so. There are limits. There are checks and balances. And the Supreme Court just reminded the Trump administration of that in the most dramatic way possible. They delivered a ruling that strips away executive protection, that says, no, Mr. President, you can't hide documents from Congress. You can't block investigations. You can't use executive privilege as a shield. This is a stunning defeat for Trump, and it changes everything. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
Attorney General Merrick Garland saying he is, quote, disappointed, but will, quote, continue to use all available tools to hold accountable those criminally responsible.
So these people, if this is their only charge, I think they're going to sort of be free of the criminal justice system. 2 of the 4 counts.
We're talking about a blockbuster Supreme Court decision that fundamentally reshapes the boundaries of presidential power. The court decisively rejected Trump's effort to use executive privilege to block disclosure of White House records to the January 6th Congressional Committee. They said those documents have to be released. Trump can't hide them. He can't claim executive privilege to keep them secret. And this wasn't a narrow technical ruling. This was the Supreme Court making a broad statement about the limits of presidential power. They emphasized that a sitting or former president cannot invoke executive privilege against the will of the current president. And they said you can't use executive privilege to hide evidence from federal investigations. That executive protection doesn't apply when Congress is conducting legitimate oversight. That transparency and accountability matter more than presidential secrecy. But it doesn't stop there. In parallel with this Supreme Court ruling, federal courts across the country have been halting Trump's executive actions. His deployment of National Guard troops to states without proper authorization, blocked. His attempts to dismantle federal agencies by executive order, blocked. His efforts to cut funding to cities and states that don't cooperate with his policies, blocked. Courts are citing constitutional overreach. They're saying presidential power does not override statutory authority. It doesn't override state sovereignty. It doesn't override Congress's constitutional role. And they're issuing injunctions stopping Trump's actions. This is a coordinated judicial pushback against executive overreach. And it's happening at every level of the court system, from district courts all the way up to the Supreme Court. Legal experts are calling this ruling a watershed moment. They say it reshapes the boundaries of presidential power. It restores checks and balances that have been eroding. It curtails the ability of future administrations to conceal questionable actions under the guise of executive protection. Because here's what was happening. Trump and his lawyers have been using executive privilege as a catch-all excuse to block any investigation they don't like. Congressional subpoenas, executive privilege, document requests, executive privilege, testimony from White House officials, executive privilege. It became a blanket shield that prevented any oversight. And the Supreme Court just said, no, that's not how executive privilege works. It has limits, and those limits matter. Now I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, good. Finally, the Supreme Court is checking Trump's power. Finally, someone is enforcing the Constitution and making it clear that presidents aren't kings. You've been watching Trump expand executive authority for months. You've seen him issue executive order after executive order. You've seen him claim powers that no previous president claimed. You've seen him try to hide documents and block investigations. And you've been wondering when the courts would step in, when someone would say enough is enough. And now the Supreme Court has done exactly that. They've drawn a line. They've said executive protection has limits, and those limits apply to Trump just like they would apply to any president. But on the flip side, Trump supporters are probably furious. They're thinking this is the deep state winning again. This is unelected judges overriding the will of the people who elected Trump. This is the establishment trying to weaken the presidency and make it impossible for Trump to govern effectively. They see this as political, as partisan judges using their power to undermine Trump's agenda, and they're worried about the precedent this sets. If courts can strip away executive protection, if they can force the release of White House documents, if they can block executive actions, what power does the president actually have? Can he govern at all? Or is he just going to be blocked at every turn by hostile judges and partisan investigations? But here's the reality. This isn't about politics. This is about the Constitution. This is about the separation of powers. This is about checks and balances. The founders didn't create a system where one person, the president, has unlimited authority. They created a system where the three branches check each other, where Congress can investigate, where courts can review executive actions, where no one, not even the president, is above the law or beyond scrutiny. And the Supreme Court just reaffirmed that system. They said executive privilege exists, but it has limits. Executive power is real, but it's not unlimited. And transparency and accountability matter even for the most powerful person in the country. The implications of this ruling are massive. It means Trump has to turn over documents to the January 6th committee, documents that could show what he knew about the attack on the Capitol, what he was doing while it was happening, what conversations he had with advisors and allies. This could be explosive information that changes our understanding of January 6th. It means Trump can't use executive privilege to block future congressional investigations. If committees subpoena documents or testimony, he has to comply unless there's a very specific reason not to. It means federal courts are going to continue blocking executive actions that overstep constitutional boundaries. Trump can't just do whatever he wants and expect the courts to rubber stamp it. And it means the presidency just got weaker and Congress and the courts just got stronger. The balance of power just shifted and Trump is on the losing end. So stick with me because we need to break down exactly what this ruling says, what documents are going to be released, and what this means for the future of presidential power. This is a game changer. All right, let's dive deep into what the Supreme Court actually ruled and why this is such a devastating blow to Trump's ability to shield himself and his administration from scrutiny. Because this ruling isn't just about one set of documents or one investigation. It's about establishing fundamental principles of how executive privilege works and when presidents can and cannot claim protection from oversight. So let's start with the January 6th documents case, because that's where the Supreme Court made its clearest statement. The House Select Committee investigating January 6th issued subpoenas for White House records from Trump's time in office. Documents about what Trump and his advisors were doing before, during, and after the attack on the Capitol. Communications, schedules, meeting notes, memos, everything that could shed light on Trump's role in the events of that day. Trump went to court trying to block the release of these documents. He claimed executive privilege. He argued that communications between a president and his advisors are protected, that releasing them would harm the presidency as an institution, that future presidents need to know their conversations will remain confidential or they won't get honest advice. But here's where Trump's argument fell apart. Executive privilege belongs to the presidency, not to the individual who was president. The current administration, under Biden at the time and continuing under Trump's second term, gets to decide whether to assert executive privilege over documents from a previous administration. And they decided not to assert it. They said these documents should be released to Congress. So Trump was essentially trying to claim executive privilege as a former president against the wishes of the current executive branch. And the Supreme Court said, no, you don't get to do that. Executive privilege is about protecting the presidency as an institution. If the current president says releasing documents doesn't harm the institution, you can't override that as a former president. This is a crucial principle. It means former presidents can't use executive privilege to hide their own misconduct. They can't claim protection that the current administration doesn't think is necessary. And they can't block congressional oversight just because they don't want documents released. The Supreme Court's reasoning went even further. They said executive privilege cannot be used to hide evidence of potential crimes or misconduct. It's a protection for legitimate presidential communications. not a shield for illegal activity. If documents show a president committed crimes or violated the Constitution, executive privilege doesn't apply. Congress has a legitimate interest in investigating misconduct, and that interest outweighs any claim of executive privilege, especially when the current administration agrees the documents should be released. This is a powerful statement. It means executive privilege has real limits. It's not a blanket protection that applies no matter what, and it can be overcome when there's evidence of wrongdoing and a legitimate need for congressional oversight. So what documents are we talking about? What's actually going to be released? We're talking about White House records from the critical period around January 6th, logs showing who Trump met with and when, communications between Trump and his advisors about the election and the certification of results, drafts of speeches and statements, records of phone calls Trump made to state officials and members of Congress, documents about the deployment or non-deployment of National Guard troops, memos discussing legal strategies and options. This is potentially explosive stuff. Documents that could show Trump knew he lost the election, but pushed fraud claims anyway. Documents that could show he was warned the crowd at the Capitol was dangerous but did nothing to stop the violence. Documents that could prove he deliberately delayed sending help. We don't know exactly what's in all these documents yet, but the fact that Trump fought so hard to keep them secret suggests there's damaging information in there. Now let's talk about the other part of this story. The federal court rulings that are blocking Trump's executive actions across multiple fronts. Because while the Supreme Court ruling on executive privilege is huge, it's part of a broader pattern of courts checking Trump's power. Federal judges have been issuing injunction after injunction stopping Trump's executive orders. And they're not just blocking the orders, they're using strong language about constitutional overreach and abuse of power. Let's break down the specific areas where courts are pushing back. National Guard deployments. Trump has been trying to deploy National Guard troops to various states, sometimes without the agreement of those states' governors. The Posse Comitatus Act and other laws restrict how the military can be used domestically. There are procedures that have to be followed, consultations that have to happen, but Trump has been trying to bypass those procedures, and federal courts are saying no. You don't have unilateral authority to deploy troops wherever you want. States have sovereignty. Governors have authority over their National Guard units, and you can't just override them with an executive order. Federal agency eliminations. Trump has issued executive orders attempting to eliminate or drastically restructure federal agencies that Congress created and funded, and courts are blocking these orders. They're saying Congress creates agencies through legislation. Congress funds them through appropriations. The president can't just eliminate them with an executive order. That's Congress's constitutional authority. The president's job is to execute the laws Congress passes, not to override those laws because he disagrees with them. This is a fundamental separation of powers issue, and courts are making clear that executive orders cannot usurp congressional authority. Funding cuts to states and localities. Trump has been threatening to cut federal funding to cities and states that don't cooperate with his policies. Sanctuary cities that won't help with immigration enforcement. States that have different environmental policies. Localities that criticize his administration. And he's been trying to redirect federal funds or withhold them entirely. But Congress appropriates money for specific purposes. The president doesn't get to change those purposes or use funding as political leverage. And federal courts are stopping these attempts. They're issuing injunctions saying Trump exceeded his authority, that he's trying to exercise power the Constitution gives to Congress. The Supreme Court itself has been requesting additional information about some of these executive actions. They've asked for briefings on Trump's National Guard deployment authority. They're signaling they're paying attention to these issues. And while they haven't issued final rulings on all of them yet, the fact that they're asking questions suggests they're concerned about executive overreach, that they might be preparing to further limit Trump's claimed authority, and that has Trump's legal team worried, because the Supreme Court has a conservative majority, 3 justices Trump himself appointed, but even this conservative court is pushing back against unlimited executive power. That tells you how extreme Trump's claims have become. Even justices who are generally sympathetic to executive authority think he's gone too far. Legal experts are analyzing what all of this means for the future of presidential power, and they're largely in agreement. This represents a major course correction. For years, presidential power has been expanding. Presidents of both parties have been claiming more and more unilateral authority. Congress has been weak and divided, unable to check the executive effectively, and courts have often deferred to presidential claims of national security or executive necessity. But now we're seeing courts push back. We're seeing them say no, there are limits. The Constitution matters. Separation of powers matters. Checks and balances matter. And presidents, even popular ones with strong political support, have to respect those limits. This is going to affect not just Trump, but all future presidents. The precedents being set right now will govern executive power for decades. When the Supreme Court says executive privilege can't be used to hide evidence of misconduct, that applies to every president going forward. When courts say presidents can't eliminate agencies Congress created, that limits what future presidents can do. When judges block military deployments that exceed statutory authority, that constrains how presidents can use the armed forces domestically, these are permanent changes to the landscape of presidential power, and they're moving us back toward the original constitutional design where no one branch dominates the others. But here's where it gets complicated. Enforcing these court orders against the president who doesn't want to comply is difficult. Courts issue rulings. They order the executive branch to do or not do certain things, but courts don't have their own police force. They rely on the executive branch to enforce their orders. So what happens if a president just defies a court order? What happens if Trump says, I don't care what the court ruled, I'm not turning over documents, or I'm not stopping this National Guard deployment, or I'm not restoring funding to that agency? That's when we have a genuine constitutional crisis. That's when the system would be tested in ways it hasn't been tested before. So far, Trump has generally complied with court orders, even while attacking the judges who issued them. He's appealed decisions he doesn't like. He's tried to find workarounds, but he hasn't outright defied a final court order. And that's important, because as long as he ultimately complies, even if he complains about it, the system is working. But if he crosses that line, if he decides court orders don't apply to him, then we're in uncharted and dangerous territory. The political fallout from these court rulings is also significant. Trump's supporters see this as proof the system is rigged against him, that unelected judges are blocking the will of the people, that the deep state is using the courts to undermine Trump's presidency. And that narrative resonates with a lot of people who already distrust institutions. But Trump's critics see this as the system working exactly as it should, as courts enforcing constitutional limits, as checks and balances preventing tyranny, as proof that no one, not even the president, is above the law. And that narrative resonates too, especially with people who are worried about authoritarian tendencies. So we have two completely different understandings of what's happening. And that divide is part of the broader polarization that defines American politics right now. Okay, let's break this down into the essential points you need to understand about this Supreme Court ruling and the broader pattern of courts checking Trump's executive power. Point number 1, the Supreme Court's rejection of Trump's executive privilege claims. The court ruled that Trump cannot use executive privilege to block release of documents to the January 6th committee. They said executive privilege belongs to the presidency as an institution, not to individual former presidents. They said it cannot be invoked against the wishes of the current administration, and they said it cannot be used to hide evidence of potential crimes or misconduct. This is a clear statement that executive privilege has limits, it's not a blanket shield, and it cannot be used to obstruct legitimate congressional investigations. This ruling applies not just to the January 6 documents, but to any future attempt by Trump or other former presidents to block oversight. Point number 2, what documents are being released and why they matter. We're talking about White House records from the period around January 6th, communications between Trump and his advisors, logs of meetings and phone calls, drafts of speeches and statements, memos about legal strategies. This is potentially explosive information that could show what Trump knew, when he knew it, and what he did or didn't do during the attack on the Capitol. The fact that Trump fought so hard to keep these documents secret suggests they contain damaging information. Once they're released and made public, we're going to learn a lot more about Trump's role in January 6th, and that could have serious legal and political consequences. Point number 3, the pattern of federal courts blocking Trump's executive actions. It's not just the Supreme Court. Federal judges across the country are issuing injunctions, stopping Trump's executive orders. They're blocking National Guard deployments that exceed statutory authority. They're stopping attempts to eliminate federal agencies without congressional approval. They're preventing funding cuts to states and localities. And they're using strong language about constitutional overreach and abuse of power. This is a coordinated judicial pushback. It shows that courts at every level are uncomfortable with how far Trump is pushing executive authority. And it means Trump is losing in court again and again on these fundamental separation of powers issues. Point number 4. What this means for the balance of power between branches. For years, presidential power has been expanding, while congressional power has been declining. Presidents have been claiming more unilateral authority. Congress has been unable or unwilling to check the executive, and courts have often deferred to presidential claims. But these recent rulings represent a course correction. Courts are reasserting their role as a check on executive power. They're saying the Constitution's separation of powers still matters, that presidents have limits, that Congress's authority cannot be usurped by executive orders. This is a fundamental rebalancing, and it's going to affect how government operates for years to come. Point number 5. The enforcement question and the risk of constitutional crisis. Courts can issue rulings, but they depend on the executive branch to enforce them. So what happens if Trump decides not to comply? What if he defies court orders? So far, he's generally complied, even while complaining. But if he crosses the line into outright defiance, we'd have a genuine constitutional crisis. The system would be tested in unprecedented ways, and how Congress, the courts, and the public respond to that would determine whether our constitutional system survives intact. This is why compliance with court orders, even ones you disagree with, is so crucial. It's what separates a system of law from a system of raw power. So where do we go from here? What happens next? The January 6th documents get released. Congress and the public get to see what's in them. And that could lead to new revelations, new investigations, maybe even new criminal charges. Trump's executive orders continue to get challenged in court. More injunctions get issued. More actions get blocked. And Trump has to decide whether to keep pushing boundaries or adjust his approach. The Supreme Court continues to receive cases about executive authority, and they may issue more rulings that further define the limits of presidential power. We're in a period of active litigation and constitutional conflict. The boundaries are being fought over and established in real time. My prediction: the documents that get released from the January 6th investigation are going to be damaging for Trump. They're going to show he knew more than he's admitted, that he did less to stop the violence than he could have, that his delay in calling off the mob was deliberate, and that's going to create more legal problems for him. Not necessarily criminal charges, though that's possible, but definitely political and historical judgment. Courts are going to continue blocking Trump's most aggressive executive orders. He's going to keep losing on separation of powers issues, and eventually he's going to have to either moderate his approach or face constant legal defeats. The Supreme Court is going to issue more rulings that clarify and limit executive power. They're signaling they're uncomfortable with unchecked presidential authority, and they're going to use future cases to establish clearer boundaries. The big question is whether Trump will accept these limits or whether he'll escalate into confrontation with the courts. If he accepts them, even grudgingly, the system works, checks and balances function, the Constitution is preserved. But if he defies court orders, if he refuses to comply, we enter unprecedented territory where the survival of our constitutional system is genuinely in question. I don't think Trump will go that far. I think he'll comply while attacking the courts and claiming persecution. But we can't be certain, and that uncertainty is itself a problem. What's clear is that Trump's strategy of using executive protection as a blanket shield has failed. The Supreme Court stripped that protection away. They said executive privilege has limits. They said courts can review and block executive actions that exceed constitutional authority. They said transparency and accountability matter even for presidents, and they established precedents that will govern executive power long after Trump is gone. This is a landmark moment, a reaffirmation of constitutional principles, a check on presidential power when it was needed most. So what's the takeaway? The Supreme Court stunned the Trump administration with a ruling that strips away executive protection. They rejected Trump's attempt to use executive privilege to hide documents from Congress. They established that former presidents can't override current administrations on privilege claims. They said executive protection can't be used to conceal evidence of misconduct, and they opened the door for courts across the country to block executive actions that exceed constitutional limits. This is a devastating blow to Trump's power, a restoration of checks and balances, and a statement that in America, no one, not even the president, is above the law or beyond scrutiny. Trump's shield is gone, his authority is limited, and accountability is coming. Stay tuned, because the documents that get released and the continued court battles are going to shape the rest of Trump's presidency and his legacy. This is history being made, and the Supreme Court just made clear that even presidents have to answer to the Constitution.